In late September 2022, a tragic case unfolded during what was meant to be a leisure trip in the mountains of Colorado, United States. The incident involved a newlywed couple, a wealthy businessman in his mid-30s and his much younger wife, who had been married for only a few weeks. They had traveled to Colorado for a hiking trip that was planned as part of their extended honeymoon. The husband, identified in official records as Thomas Reed, was a 36-year-old entrepreneur from Dallas, Texas. He owned several real estate properties and had investments in multiple business ventures. Known among his peers as a private but generous man, Thomas had a reputation for enjoying outdoor activities, especially hiking and mountain climbing. His wife, Emma Collins, was 23 years old and originally from a small town in Oklahoma. Before the marriage, Emma had been working as a freelance photographer. Friends described her as energetic, social, and adventurous. The couple had met 2 years prior at a charity event in Dallas, and their relationship quickly developed. They were married in early September 2022 in a private ceremony attended by close family and friends. For their honeymoon, the couple first traveled to several coastal cities before deciding to spend a week in Colorado's Rocky Mountains. According to travel itineraries later reviewed by investigators, Thomas had booked a luxury lodge near Estes Park. The couple planned several outdoor activities, including a day-long hiking trip on a well-known mountain trail. The hiking trip was scheduled for September 28, 2022. Weather reports for that day indicated mild conditions, with clear skies and temperatures suitable for hiking. The trail they selected was popular among tourists and generally considered safe for those with moderate hiking experience. Thomas and Emma reportedly set out in the morning with basic hiking gear, water, and snacks. Witness accounts collected later suggested that the couple appeared to be in good spirits at the start of the hike. Several hikers who saw them along the lower section of the trail recalled that they were walking together, talking, and taking photographs. There were no visible signs of conflict or distress at that stage. However, as later events would reveal, the day would take a deadly turn. Somewhere along the trail, far from the starting point and out of sight from other hikers, an altercation occurred between Thomas and Emma. By the end of the day, one of them would not return alive. The case would later draw national attention, not only because of the tragic outcome but also due to the unusual circumstances. A wealthy groom, a younger bride, a secluded hiking trail, and a fatal confrontation. It would become the subject of legal proceedings, media coverage, and public discussion about relationships, domestic disputes, and violence in isolated locations. This story begins with the couple's arrival in Colorado, the days leading up to the hike, and the moments before the incident that would change their lives forever. Thomas Reed was a 36-year-old man who had built his wealth through a combination of real estate development and early investments in several technology startups. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, Thomas came from a middle-class background but had worked diligently to reach financial independence by his early 30s. Those who knew him described him as disciplined and reserved. He was not someone who shared details of his personal life openly, but in professional settings he was confident and persuasive. Outside of work, Thomas enjoyed outdoor recreation, particularly hiking and mountain trekking. Friends said he often used these activities as a way to disconnect from business responsibilities. He had previously taken hiking trips across different parts of the United States, as well as to several national parks abroad. For him, hiking was both a physical challenge and a form of relaxation. Emma Collins, 23, came from a small community in Oklahoma. She was the youngest of 3 siblings and had studied graphic design for 2 years before deciding to work as a freelance photographer. Her photography often focused on landscapes, and she occasionally took on assignments for weddings or local events. Friends and acquaintances remembered her as sociable and curious, with an interest in travel and new experiences. Emma met Thomas in 2020 at a charity auction in Dallas. At the time, she had been invited by a mutual acquaintance. Thomas, who attended as one of the event sponsors, reportedly noticed her while she was photographing the gathering. Their first conversation was brief but friendly. Over the following months, they began meeting more regularly. The relationship developed quickly, despite the differences in age and lifestyle. By early 2022, Thomas proposed during a trip to Hawaii. The engagement was announced to their families but kept private from the public. In September of that year, they held a small wedding ceremony in Texas. Guests later told investigators that the atmosphere at the wedding appeared joyful, and no one noticed any significant tension between the two. After the ceremony, Thomas and Emma began their honeymoon with a series of short trips to coastal destinations in California. The final part of their honeymoon was planned as a week-long stay in Colorado, where they intended to explore the Rocky Mountain region. According to hotel booking records, Thomas had arranged for a luxury lodge near Estes Park from September 26 to October 2, 2022. The first 2 days in Colorado were spent visiting local attractions and adjusting to the altitude. They visited a small art gallery, dined at 2 well-known restaurants, and took short walks around the area. Staff at the lodge later told police that the couple appeared polite and generally kept to themselves. They did not overhear any arguments or unusual activity. On the evening of September 27th, Thomas discussed with lodge staff his plans for the next day's hike. He asked about trail conditions and was advised that the weather would be clear, with mild temperatures and no expected storms. The staff recommended a popular trail known for scenic views and moderate difficulty, suitable for a day hike. Early on the morning of September 28th, the couple prepared for the outing. Thomas carried a small hiking backpack containing bottled water, snack bars, a first aid kit, and a camera. Emma also brought her own camera equipment. They left the lodge shortly after 8 a.m. and drove to the trailhead, arriving about 30 minutes later. Several other hikers were present at the trail entrance that morning. Some recalled seeing the couple together, noting that they appeared well prepared and in good spirits. Emma was seen taking photographs at the base of the trail, while Thomas checked the route map. The first section of the hike involved a steady incline through forested terrain. Witnesses who passed them along this section reported that the couple was walking side by side, talking, and occasionally stopping for photographs. One hiker remembered hearing Emma laugh during a brief rest stop. As the trail climbed higher, the surroundings became more rugged, with fewer people on the path. By late morning, the couple had reached a scenic overlook where they paused for photographs. This was the last point along the trail where other hikers distinctly recalled seeing them together. From this point forward, the couple continued into a less crowded section of the trail. The path wound through rocky terrain and narrow ridges, leading toward a viewpoint several miles from the starting area. This part of the trail was still marked and maintained, but it was less frequently traveled, making it quieter and more secluded. According to the investigation, there were no witnesses who saw the couple together beyond this stage. The area ahead was known for its striking views but also for limited visibility between hikers due to the bends and elevation changes. At this stage in the day, the weather remained stable, and there were no environmental factors that suggested immediate danger. However, it was in this section, away from the presence of other hikers, that the circumstances leading to the fatal incident began to unfold. The hours leading up to that moment, as reconstructed later through evidence and testimony, showed no outward signs of imminent conflict. Yet, the quiet isolation of the trail created conditions in which a private disagreement could escalate without interruption. This set the stage for the events that would follow. By late morning on September 28, 2022, Thomas Reed and Emma Collins had moved deeper into the hiking trail, beyond the sections where most visitors usually turned back. This portion of the route was narrower, with uneven rocky surfaces and occasional steep inclines. The air was noticeably cooler at this elevation, but visibility remained good, and there were no immediate environmental hazards. According to GPS data retrieved from Thomas's smartwatch, the couple maintained a steady pace during the first 2 hours of the hike. The device recorded several pauses at scenic spots, likely for rest or photography. Emma's camera, later collected as evidence, contained multiple photographs from that morning, showing mountain views, wildflowers, and one image of Thomas standing on a rock ledge. At approximately 11:30 a.m., the couple reached an isolated ridge with a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. Based on the timestamp of the last photograph on Emma's camera, this was the final documented moment before the sequence of events that led to the fatal incident began. Investigators later pieced together the early stages of the altercation through a combination of digital evidence and forensic analysis of the scene. While no eyewitnesses were present in this section of the trail, physical evidence suggested that the couple had stopped for an extended period. Footprints, disturbed gravel, and a water bottle found on the ground indicated that they had been stationary for some time before moving again. The exact reason for the dispute that followed remains uncertain. Friends and family members interviewed after the incident reported no known history of physical violence between Thomas and Emma prior to the marriage. However, some acquaintances of Emma mentioned that she had expressed frustration over differences in lifestyle and expectations since the wedding. Similarly, a colleague of Thomas recalled that he had privately expressed concerns about adjusting to a younger partner's personality. While the investigation could not confirm the specific subject of the disagreement, evidence suggested that it began as a verbal exchange. This likely occurred as they prepared to leave the ridge and continue along the path. The location was far enough from the main trail that raised voices would not have been heard by other hikers. From the disturbed trail surface and patterns of movement in the soil, investigators concluded that the argument escalated. Items from Thomas's backpack, including snack wrappers and a folded trail map, were later found scattered in a small area off the path, consistent with the possibility of a physical struggle. Emma's camera strap was discovered torn, with the camera itself found several feet away, partially concealed under brush. At some point, the argument appears to have moved from the ridge area to a narrower section of the path. Forensic analysis showed fresh scuff marks on the trail edge, along with imprints that matched the tread of both Thomas's hiking boots and Emma's shoes. The markings suggested abrupt, irregular movements rather than steady walking. The next stage of events remains partially unclear, but investigators believe that physical contact occurred. Bruising later documented during the autopsy indicated that Emma sustained impact injuries before her death. Soil and small rock fragments found on her clothing matched the surface of the path in that section, supporting the conclusion that she had fallen or been forced to the ground. Based on Thomas's later statements to police, he claimed that the situation got out of control during an argument. However, his account of the sequence and cause of the injuries was inconsistent with forensic evidence, leading investigators to treat his statements with caution. The location of the incident created additional complications. The trail segment where the altercation occurred had steep drop-offs on one side. While the path was considered safe for careful hikers, a fall from certain points could result in serious injury. Investigators documented several disturbed areas along the slope where vegetation had been broken, indicating movement or contact during the incident. Emma's body was later found approximately 20 feet downslope from the trail. Evidence suggested that she had sustained blunt force trauma before coming to rest in that position. The absence of other hikers in the area during this time meant there were no direct witnesses to confirm the sequence of actions. The triggering event, the initial disagreement and escalation, marked the point at which an ordinary hiking trip turned into a fatal confrontation. This was the last point in the day when intervention from others could have prevented the outcome, but the isolation of the trail made that impossible. By early afternoon, Thomas descended the trail alone. His arrival back at the trailhead was noted by two hikers who saw him walking quickly without speaking. They assumed nothing unusual until emergency services were later dispatched to the area. Thomas did not report the incident immediately. Instead, he returned to the lodge and, according to staff records, appeared visibly shaken but said little about his hike. It was not until lodge staff contacted local authorities, after Thomas allegedly made a vague statement about an accident, that a search was initiated. By then, weather conditions had begun to change slightly, with cooler temperatures and increasing wind making the search more difficult. The discovery of Emma's body later that afternoon marked the formal beginning of the criminal investigation. Authorities quickly determined that the circumstances did not align with a simple hiking accident. The location of her injuries, the evidence of a struggle, and the inconsistencies in Thomas's account pointed to a violent encounter rather than an accidental fall. This triggering event, the argument that escalated beyond control in a remote location, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. It transformed what had started as a private disagreement between two people into a matter of public record and legal consequence. The discovery of Emma Collins's body on the slope below the hiking trail immediately shifted the nature of the case from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. Search team members, accompanied by local sheriff's deputies, reached the location around 5 p.m. on September 28, 2022. Paramedics confirmed that Emma was deceased at the scene. Initial examination showed multiple injuries inconsistent with a simple slip or fall. In addition to blunt force trauma to her head and upper body, there were visible marks on her arms and wrists, suggesting that she had been grabbed or restrained. Dirt and plant matter embedded in her clothing and skin indicated that she had made contact with the ground in more than one location before coming to rest. Deputies noted that Thomas Reed was not present during the discovery of the body. Instead, he had returned to the lodge and was found sitting alone in the lounge area. Witnesses, including lodge staff and guests, described him as pale and withdrawn, avoiding eye contact. When deputies approached and informed him that Emma had been located, Thomas's reaction was subdued. He told them, "It was an accident. We argued she slipped." Thomas was taken to the local sheriff's office for questioning that evening. During the first interview, he stated that he and Emma had disagreed about the pace of the hike and whether to continue past a certain point. He claimed that Emma walked ahead, turned to speak to him, and lost her balance near the trail edge. According to Thomas, he tried to reach her but could not stop her from falling. However, investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Thomas's account of the location where she fell did not match where her body was found. The physical evidence along the trail, including signs of a struggle, contradicted the claim that she had simply slipped while walking. Meanwhile, crime scene technicians documented and collected physical evidence from the trail area. They photographed disturbed ground, broken vegetation, and scattered belongings, including Emma's torn camera strap and personal items. These findings suggested a confrontation before the fall. The next day, September 29th, the county coroner conducted a full autopsy. The report, released later, determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and torso, with additional contributing injuries consistent with assault. The coroner also noted defensive wounds on Emma's forearms, indicating that she had attempted to protect herself. By this point, the investigation had shifted focus from determining whether a crime had occurred to establishing the sequence of events and identifying the responsible party. Detectives examined both Thomas's and Emma's digital devices, including their phones and cameras. Messages retrieved from Emma's phone revealed recent tensions between the couple, including disagreements during the earlier part of their honeymoon. Investigators also reviewed GPS data from Thomas's smartwatch and location data from his phone. These records showed that after the time of the alleged fall, Thomas remained in the area for several minutes before beginning his descent, a detail not mentioned in his initial statement. This raised questions about what he did during that time and why he did not immediately seek help. On September 30th, detectives conducted a second interview with Thomas. When confronted with discrepancies between his account and the physical evidence, Thomas adjusted parts of his story. He admitted that the couple had argued on the ridge and that Emma had become upset. He claimed that during the argument she pulled away from him and stumbled toward the edge. He said he may have grabbed her arm to stop her, but that she fell in the process. While this version acknowledged physical contact, it still conflicted with forensic findings indicating multiple impacts and injuries sustained before the fall. Detectives also considered the fact that Emma's torn camera strap and scattered belongings were found in a location several feet from where Thomas claimed the incident occurred. The investigation gained further momentum when two hikers came forward on October 1st. They told deputies that they had seen Thomas descending the trail alone in the early afternoon. They recalled that he was moving quickly with his head down, and did not respond when one of them greeted him. While this alone was not evidence of guilt, it reinforced the timeline that placed him leaving the scene without attempting to alert other hikers to an emergency. On October 2nd, the sheriff's office obtained a warrant to search Thomas's lodge room. Investigators seized his hiking clothes, boots, and backpack. Forensic testing later revealed trace amounts of Emma's blood on the lower hem of his shirt and on one hiking boot. These findings further weakened the possibility of an accidental fall. By October 3rd, the sheriff's office had consulted with the district attorney, who agreed that sufficient probable cause existed to arrest Thomas Reed on suspicion of second-degree murder. Detectives executed the arrest at the lodge that afternoon. Thomas did not resist and requested legal counsel immediately. News of the arrest quickly reached both local and national media. The case drew attention not only because of the circumstances, a wealthy groom and a young bride on their honeymoon, but also because of the isolated setting and conflicting narratives. Public interest intensified as court documents revealed the extent of the forensic evidence. In the weeks following the arrest, prosecutors worked to build a timeline that aligned physical evidence, digital records, and witness accounts. The defense, meanwhile, maintained that Emma's death was a tragic accident resulting from a heated argument and an unfortunate misstep. The tension surrounding the case increased as pretrial hearings began. Prosecutors filed motions to admit photographs from the scene, autopsy results, and GPS data as evidence. The defense sought to exclude certain photographs, arguing they were prejudicial. While the legal process moved forward, friends and relatives of both Thomas and Emma grappled with the reality of the situation. Emma's family, in particular, pushed for a full accounting of events, expressing doubt that her death was anything other than intentional. Thomas's acquaintances expressed surprise at the allegations but acknowledged that the evidence presented so far painted a troubling picture. By the time the trial date was set, the case had shifted from an investigation of unclear circumstances to a structured legal battle over responsibility and intent. The rising tension was no longer confined to the trail where the incident occurred. It had moved into the courtroom where the fate of Thomas Reed would be decided. The trial of Thomas Reed began in late May 2023 at the Larimer County District Court in Colorado. The courtroom was filled with reporters, members of the public, and family members from both sides. The proceedings were closely followed by national media outlets, given the unusual combination of circumstances: a wealthy groom, a younger bride, a honeymoon trip, and a fatal incident on a mountain trail. Thomas faced the charge of second-degree murder, along with a lesser-included charge of manslaughter. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense team argued that the death of Emma Collins was the result of a tragic accident during a heated argument and that there was no intent to cause harm. The prosecution opened its case by presenting the overall timeline of September 28, 2022. Lead prosecutor Karen Blake described the couple's hike from start to finish, pointing out key times when the evidence contradicted Thomas's statements. She told the jury that the case was about a conflict that escalated in an isolated place, leading to a violent outcome. The first witnesses were members of the search and rescue team who described finding Emma's body on the slope. They explained the terrain, the condition of her clothing, and the visible injuries. Their testimony established that the scene did not match a simple slip-and-fall accident. The county coroner, Dr. Matthew Cole, testified next. He presented the autopsy findings, showing photographs to the jury that documented blunt force trauma to Emma's head and torso, as well as defensive wounds on her forearms. Dr. Cole stated that the injuries indicated multiple impacts before the fall and that the cause of death was consistent with an assault followed by a fall down the slope. Prosecutors then called forensic analysts who had examined the physical evidence from the trail and from Thomas's clothing. A crime scene technician explained how soil and plant material found on Emma's clothing matched areas of disturbed ground on the trail, confirming that she had been in physical contact with the ground in multiple locations before her final position. Another analyst testified that trace amounts of Emma's blood were found on Thomas's shirt and one of his hiking boots. GPS data from Thomas's smartwatch was introduced to show that he remained in the area for several minutes after the fall before beginning his descent. The prosecutor emphasized this as evidence that he did not immediately seek help, contradicting his claim of rushing to get assistance. Digital evidence from Emma's phone included photographs taken during the hike and text messages sent to a friend earlier in the trip, in which she mentioned recent arguments with Thomas. While the defense objected to the admissibility of these messages, the judge allowed them to be read to the jury as evidence of the couple's relationship dynamics in the days leading up to the incident. The prosecution also called two hikers who had seen Thomas descending the trail alone. Both testified that he appeared to be moving quickly and did not respond when greeted. While their testimony did not directly prove guilt, it reinforced the timeline showing that Thomas left the scene without raising an immediate alarm. When it was the defense's turn, attorney Michael Carter focused on casting doubt on the prosecution's theory. He argued that the physical evidence could also be consistent with an accidental fall during an argument, and that Thomas's delay in seeking help might have been the result of shock or disorientation. Carter called his own forensic expert, who suggested that some of Emma's injuries could have occurred during the fall itself rather than beforehand. Thomas Reed took the stand in his own defense. He testified that the couple had argued about whether to continue the hike. According to him, Emma became upset and moved toward the edge of the trail while speaking to him. He said he reached out to grab her arm, but she pulled away, lost her balance, and fell. Thomas admitted that the argument had been heated but insisted that he never intended to hurt her. During cross-examination, the prosecution pressed Thomas on the inconsistencies between his testimony and earlier statements to investigators. They questioned why he had not called for help immediately and why he had returned to the lodge without alerting other hikers. Thomas responded that he was in shock and not thinking clearly. The most intense moment of the trial came when the prosecution replayed body camera footage from the deputies who first approached Thomas at the lodge. In the footage, Thomas appeared calm and gave only minimal details about what had happened. Prosecutor Blake argued that his demeanor was inconsistent with that of someone who had just witnessed an accidental death. Closing arguments summarized the two competing narratives. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the totality of the evidence, the physical signs of a struggle, the forensic findings, and Thomas's changing statements, as proof that Emma's death was not an accident. The defense countered that the prosecution had not proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt and that reasonable explanations existed for each piece of evidence. After several days of testimony and presentation of exhibits, the case was handed to the jury. Deliberations began on the morning of June 8, 2023. Jurors reviewed physical evidence, GPS records, and the autopsy report. They requested to rehear portions of Thomas's testimony and the coroner's statements. The tension in the courtroom was high as the jury returned with its verdict after nearly 2 full days of deliberation. The moment marked the peak of the case, the point where months of investigation, weeks of trial, and hours of testimony converged into a single decision that would determine Thomas Reed's future. On the afternoon of June 9, 2023, the jury returned to the courtroom to deliver its verdict in the case of State of Colorado versus Thomas Reed. The atmosphere was quiet, with only the sound of the clerk calling the court to order. Thomas sat at the defense table between his attorneys, looking straight ahead. Members of Emma Collins's family were seated in the first row of the gallery, holding hands. When the presiding judge asked the jury foreperson for the verdict, the foreperson stood and read, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Reed, guilty of murder in the second degree." There was no visible reaction from Thomas, though his attorney placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Emma's family members began to cry quietly, and one of her sisters leaned against their mother. The judge thanked the jury for its service and formally accepted the verdict. The decision meant that the jury believed Thomas had caused Emma's death with intent, though without premeditation, which is the legal definition of second-degree murder in Colorado. The lesser-included charge of manslaughter was not considered, since the jury had already found him guilty of the higher offense. Following the reading of the verdict, the court moved to the sentencing phase. In Colorado, second-degree murder carries a possible sentence of 16 to 48 years in state prison. Prosecutors argued for a sentence near the upper end of the range, citing the nature of the crime, the isolated circumstances, and what they described as a deliberate failure to seek help immediately after the incident. Lead prosecutor Karen Blake addressed the court directly, stating, "The victim was a young woman on her honeymoon. She trusted the defendant with her safety, and that trust was broken in the most irreversible way." She asked the court to impose a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the offense and the impact on Emma's family. The defense requested a sentence closer to the lower end of the range. Attorney Michael Carter argued that the incident had occurred during a heated moment and that Thomas had no history of violent behavior. He said, "This was not a pre-planned act. It was the result of a tragic argument that turned physical. Mr. Reed will live the rest of his life knowing his actions caused the loss of someone he cared about." Before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Emma's mother spoke first, describing her daughter as a kind, adventurous young woman whose life had been cut short. She told the court, "We trusted him to care for her. Instead, we had to bring her home in a casket." Emma's older brother also addressed the court, saying that the family had been living with an open wound since her death and that no sentence could undo the damage. Thomas was given the opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood and in a steady voice said, "I am deeply sorry for what happened that day. I never meant for Emma to be hurt. I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't. I understand that nothing I say will ease the pain of her family." He did not admit to intentionally causing her death but acknowledged responsibility for the circumstances that led to it. After hearing from both sides, the judge delivered the sentence. In his remarks, the judge said that while there was no evidence of premeditation, the evidence showed that Thomas's actions on the trail had been intentional in the moment and that he failed to take immediate steps to save Emma's life. The court finds that the nature of this offense and the harm caused warrant a significant period of incarceration, the judge said. Thomas Reed was sentenced to 38 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, followed by 5 years of mandatory parole. He was immediately remanded into custody and escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs. In the days following the sentencing, the case remained a subject of public discussion. News outlets covered the outcome extensively, highlighting the combination of digital evidence, forensic findings, and witness testimony that had led to the conviction. Legal analysts noted that the prosecution's ability to link physical evidence on the trail to Thomas's actions had been critical in persuading the jury. Emma's family expressed relief that the trial was over and that there had been a guilty verdict. In a brief statement to the press, her mother said, "We have justice, but we do not have Emma back. That's something we will live with for the rest of our lives." Thomas's attorneys announced plans to file an appeal, arguing that certain evidence admitted at trial should have been excluded. They claimed that some of the prosecution's digital evidence was prejudicial and not directly connected to the incident. Legal experts commented that while appeals are common in such cases, overturning a conviction based on evidentiary issues can be difficult unless there is a clear legal error. With the conclusion of the trial and sentencing, the legal chapter of the case reached its end. Thomas was transferred to a state correctional facility to begin serving his sentence. Emma's family returned home to Oklahoma, where they held a private memorial service attended by close friends and relatives. The resolution in court provided a definitive outcome after months of uncertainty, but for those involved, the emotional and personal consequences would continue far beyond the legal process. The verdict and sentence closed the case in a formal sense, but the loss, grief, and questions left behind would remain. In the months following the tragedy, both families were left struggling to make sense of what had happened. For Aisha's family, the grief was all-consuming. Her parents found themselves replaying the events of her short marriage over and over, asking if there were warning signs they missed. Her mother would sit quietly in the living room, staring at photographs of Aisha in her wedding dress, the same dress she wore just days before her life was taken. "She looked so happy that day," her mother said in a later interview, her voice breaking. "I never imagined I would bury my daughter before she turned 25. Her father, usually a reserved man, took a more public role in advocating for awareness about domestic violence in young marriages. He began speaking at local mosques, community centers, and universities, telling Aisha's story as a warning to other families. "We teach our daughters how to be good wives," he said to one audience. "But we must also teach our sons how to be safe husbands, and that controlling or hurting your partner is never acceptable." For Omar's family, the impact was equally devastating, though in a different way. His parents had to grapple with the reality that their son, the boy they raised who prayed beside them at the mosque, had committed an irreversible act of violence. His mother refused to speak to the press, while his father expressed a mix of sorrow and shame. "I lost my son too," he admitted, "but I know the pain of our loss can never compare to theirs." Inside the prison walls, Omar began his sentence with a mixture of defiance and denial. At first, he told anyone who would listen that it had been an accident, a moment of anger gone too far. But over time, as the months passed and he faced the quiet reality of incarceration, some of that bravado faded. In counseling sessions mandated by the prison system, he spoke haltingly about his inability to control his temper and his feelings of jealousy. Still, whether out of pride or fear, he never fully admitted the depth of what he had done. The community reaction was complex. In the early weeks after the crime, people whispered about what had happened, some siding with Aisha's family, others quietly defending Omar. But as more details emerged during the trial, public opinion shifted strongly towards sympathy for Aisha and her loved ones. The local mosque held a special remembrance service, where the imam spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the obligation to protect one another. "Love," he told the congregation, "is not ownership. It is trust, kindness, and mercy." Aisha's friends organized a scholarship in her name at the university where she had studied. Each year, it would be awarded to a young woman pursuing social work or counseling, fields Aisha had once considered for herself. The first recipient, a student named Layla, spoke openly about how the scholarship inspired her to work with survivors of domestic abuse. "Aisha's life was short," she said, "but her story can help others find safety and hope." For the broader community, the case sparked difficult but necessary conversations. Parents began discussing healthy relationships more openly with their children. Workshops on conflict resolution and emotional control were held in local centers, often in both English and Arabic to reach as many residents as possible. Faith leaders stressed the importance of recognizing red flags early, and women's support groups reported an increase in calls from individuals seeking advice or assistance. Even years later, the emotional wounds remained. Aisha's younger brother, who had been close to her, admitted he struggled with trust and relationships after her death. "I don't know how to let my guard down," he confessed to a friend. "If my own sister could go from a wedding to a funeral in a week, how can I believe in forever with anyone?" Meanwhile, Omar's extended relatives, cousins, uncles, and aunts, found themselves navigating awkward silences and unspoken judgment within the community. Some moved away to avoid the constant reminder of what had happened. Others stayed but kept to themselves, avoiding large gatherings. In reflecting on the tragedy, one journalist who had covered the case from the beginning wrote, "This was not just the story of a crime. It was the story of two families, one grieving a daughter, the other grieving the son they thought they knew, and a community forced to confront uncomfortable truths about love, control, and violence." The final chapter of this story, if there can be one, rests in its lessons. The families will never be the same. The community, though scarred, has become more aware. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of homes and hearts, people remember Aisha not for how she died, but for how she lived. Her laughter, her kindness, and the dreams she never had the chance to fulfill. As her father said during a memorial held 5 years after her death, "We cannot change the past, but we can honor her by changing the future." If even one woman finds safety because of Aisha's story, then her life will still shine with meaning. And with that, the gathered crowd bowed their heads, in prayer, in grief, and in the hope that no other family would have to endure the same loss.